Okay. I have to apologize to you guys. I asked you a question at the end of class last week. And you
It
should
wasn't
not
in
know.
there.
Because it's not in there.
Yeah.
Because it's like 2 pages earlier in chapter 10 was the information that I was looking for. And this is a problem with having read a book and then not asking you to read the whole book. I, in this case, missed the mark. So if you look in your books on on page 205, it talks about the beginning of his farm that he bought in 1961, and it says here, determined to start over again, William Salatin went shopping for farmland within a day's drive of Washington, D.C., so that he might continue petitioning the Venezuelan embassy for compensation. He ended up buying 550 acres of badly eroded and hilly farmland on the western edge of the Shenandoah Valley in a tiny town of Swoop. It's pronounced Swope. After Drew Pearson, the heartbreaking journalist, publicized his case against the Venezuelans, Salatin owned a small settlement and that he used to buy small herd of cattle. The farm had been abused by tenant farmers for 150 years. On land that was really too steep for row crops, several generations of tenant farmers had grown corn and other grains till most of the soil had either been exhausted or lost to erosion. We measured gullies 14 feet deep. This farm could not stand any more plowing. In many places, there was no topsoil left whatsoever, just outcroppings of granite and clay. Some spots you couldn't even dig a post hole. So Dad would fill tires with concrete and sink fence posts and that. We've been working to heal this land ever since. So yeah, it was a couple of pages before chapter 11. So we're asking you for information that I had actually not asked you to read. So my apologies for that. But hopefully you did read chapter 8 and chapter 11. So Joel Salatin's family took over this plot of land that was relatively eroded. If you go back to chapter 8, you'll also discover that I got the ratios of pasture to forest incorrect. It's 550 acres total.
It only leaves 100 for.
100 of it is pasture.
No.
I had these flipped in my head for some reason. 150 acres is forest.
I think that makes it even more.
Yeah, it makes it even more striking the amount of production that they get off of this plot of land. So, in chapter 8, there's a section of the book called The Genius of the Place. When Poland talks about the genius of the place, what is he referring to? So it's essentially talking about nutrient cycling. The whole point of us going through and thinking about nutrient cycling diagrams and how nutrient cycling occurs in ecosystems is because this section of the chapter is about, or this section of the book is about a farm that is essentially built on these ideas of how nutrients get cycled in ecosystems. So if Joel Salatin was referring to himself, what type of farmer would he refer to himself as? Is he a farmer of cows, a farmer of chickens, farmer of eggs, farmer of...
grass farmer?
He's a grass farmer. Explain that, Sydney.
Oh gosh. So there's like multiple types of grass needed, something like that?
Well, there's
Yeah.
hundreds of species of grasses. And they're...
But like the grass is the most important part of this, like, because the grass is what they eat and the grass is where they like,
The grass is the base of
Yeah.
this particular food web. So the Friday that most of these guys were gone, I posted that video. For whatever reason, that video stopped filming at 24 minutes. But you get kind of an idea of what we were doing when we were exploring this food web in oak forests in the northeast United States. But the food web begins with the primary producers that are on the surface of the soil. And in the case of Joel Salatin's farm, a lot of this is grasses, But some of this is forbs, and one important group of forbs that have pinnately compound leaves I'm not going to draw the rest of the leaves, and they have root nodules in the roots. This is in a general class of plants called forbs. These are dicot plants that are herbaceous. So trees are dicots. They have a taproot. They have netted venation in their leaves, as opposed to grasses that have adventitious or fibrous root systems that have parallel venation in the leaves. But these forbs aren't trees because they don't develop woody growth. They actually stay what we call herbaceous. They're soft. So things like spinach and clover and things like this. But there are particular types of forbs that have root systems with root nodules. What lives in these root nodules? From back in nutrient cycling material.
The legumes?
So this is a particular type of forb called a legume. These are things like beans, anything that produces its seeds in pods.
So that, like, bacteria.
They are bacteria. These root nodules contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so they can take nitrogen out of the air and convert it into ammonia in the roots. And nitrate in the roots also. And so these two different kinds of plants, grasses and forbs, are what are going to be feeding the cows and feeding the chickens and feeding the rabbits and feeding the turkeys and all of that. Although turkeys really like to live in forested environments also, although you'll find them out in agricultural fields feeding on the leavings of farms after the crops have been harvested. This time of year, in particular after corn harvest has been done, there's plenty of corn kernels laying around in the field, and you'll see in the early mornings as you're driving around, you'll see flocks of turkeys out in the fields eating the leftover corn kernels on the ground. You'll also see big flocks of snow geese in the winter that hang out in old agricultural fields.
It's the best place to go hunting.
Pardon?
It's the best place to go hunting.
It's a pretty good place to go
It's
hunting,
perfect.
actually. If you ever see a big flock of snow geese hanging out in an agricultural field, keep your eye peeled for bald eagles. Bald eagles feed off of snow geese, so oftentimes flying around the periphery of snow geese flocks, you'll see bald eagles hanging out wanting to pick off an occasional snow goose. I was out in Marshall, Missouri one winter, and there was this huge flock of snow geese hanging out in these old cornfields that had been harvested earlier in the fall. And I saw maybe 12 or 13 bald eagles all around this one big, huge flock of snow geese. And in spots that you could see a couple of bald eagles that were down on the ground. And when you looked at them through your spotting scope or through your binoculars, you could see that they were on the ground feeding on snow geese that they had captured and killed. So these agricultural fields can provide food for organisms. But basically, the plant community community is a group of organisms made up of multiple species that live in a particular place at a particular time. So we have populations. So in ecological terms, a population is a number of individuals of the same species living in a particular place at a particular time. But a community of organisms is members of multiple species living in a particular place at a particular time. And so when I talk about a community, I'm talking about a community of grasses and forbs and legumes and everybody. And when I'm talking about a population, I might be talking about a population of Kentucky bluegrass or something like this. So that's a particular species of plant, and so when I'm talking about the population, I'm talking about that particular species of plant that makes up that population. But really of concern to Joel Salatin is the community of plants, but a big part of that community of plants is grasses. And so these grasses form the energetic base of the food web. A food web is ultimately a diagram that illustrates energy flow through an ecosystem. So ultimately, energy is coming from the sun. And this is a review. We've talked about this somewhat in class already. Photons of light come down to the grasses. That light gets converted into energy through the process of photosynthesis. Yeah, no.
What's the end of the population?
Species living in a particular place at a particular time. Yeah, so everything has a spatial and temporal context to it. You, just to take an example, you exist in a population of humans at William Jewell College. And that's where you do most of your interacting right now. You're much more likely to interact ecologically, socially, etc., with people who live in this little plot of land at the top of this hill than you are likely to interact with people from KU, for example, or the Crossroads district of Kansas City, or Olathe. And so you could speak of a population of humans at William Jewell College. Now that population of humans is a subpopulation of a population of humans in Liberty, and that then is a subpopulation of a population of humans in Kansas City, the greater Kansas City area. But in all those cases, you're much more likely to interact with people from Liberty, people from William Jewell, or people from the greater Kansas City area than you are likely to interact with people from Fort Hays, Kansas. And so one of the ways that we define what a population is by the level of interactions, and the way ecologists and evolutionary biologists define interaction is by gene flow. You're much more likely to exchange genes with somebody here on campus. Not that I'm advocating you exchanging genes among individuals here on William Jewell College campus. Save that for sometime later when you have more time for exchanging genes. But we can actually look at the genes of organisms and tell whether you're a part of this population or another population by the kinds of different variants of your DNA that you have. So I have a student, Chris Cotton, who's doing a population genetics thing. We're actually looking at the genes of lizards to basically see which populations are most closely related to one another and how much these populations are separated from other populations by looking at single nucleotide causal groups, single nucleotide variations in their DNA. So you are part of a population of humans, but because we're just talking about humans, that makes you a population. But you're also a member of a biological community that lives here on the hill because you share this space not only with a bunch of other humans, but you share it with worms that are in the ground that you don't even see, and squirrels that are in the trees that you do see, and plants that are on the landscape. And so all of those species together, because they occur in the same place at the same time, we would call that a community of organisms. And sometimes we subset that community by talking about the plant community versus the animal community. In some cases we talk about the reptile community versus the bird community at a particular place. But all those are multi-species assemblages of individuals living in a particular place at a particular time. Does that help? So Salatin is relying on this community of plants, and this community of plants serves as the energetic base of the food web because these plants, whether they are grasses or whether they are forbs, these plants harvest solar energy to create glucose That glucose goes into the building of their bodies, and when a cow or a chicken or a sheep or a rabbit or a turkey eats the grass or the food, that energy gets transferred to the animal. So this goes into cows, this goes into chickens, this goes into turkeys, this goes into pigs, this goes into rabbits. This goes into all of those organisms that are found on page 222. Oh, I got that. So all of that energy from both the grasses and the forbs goes into these other organisms. And then where do those organisms go after they've spent their time on the farm?
To humans.
Yeah, all of these things ultimately go to humans that are off farm, who are the ultimate consumers of the things that Joel Salatin grows. So when we think of food webs, does energy get cycled within food webs, or does energy take a one-way path through ecosystems? Does energy get cycled, or is it a one-way path through the ecosystem?
I mean, it gets cycled, but you don't totally see it in the food web. Because, like, we don't track when humans, like, die or, like, animals die.
So when a human dies, well, when any of these things die, what happens to their bodies? Pardon? So it decomposes,
Yeah.
and what happens to all the energy that's in that body?
Goes back into the earth, doesn't it?
What
Kinda.
happens to it? Go back to your carbon cycle. When we
Is it like self-respiration?
soil respiration is just actually bacteria doing the process of decomposition. What is this process by which we take carbon-containing molecules, get the energy out of them, and it leads to this byproduct that gets released to the environment? What's the byproduct? We take the carbon that is pent up in organisms. What is this carbon-containing molecule called again? Glucose. We add oxygen to it, and it releases carbon dioxide, water, and it releases the energy that is contained within the glucose. Where does that carbon dioxide go to?
The air?
It goes back to the atmosphere. So all of these organisms, the grasses, are sending CO2 back to the atmosphere, which is the spent energy, the byproduct of the spent energy. Forbs are sending CO2 back to the atmosphere. Rabbits send CO2 back to the atmosphere. Pigs send CO2 back to the atmosphere. Turkeys send CO2 back to the atmosphere. Chickens, cows, everybody sends CO2 back to the atmosphere. Humans spend CO2, generate CO2 and send it back to the atmosphere. Because we're all doing this, we're all doing this equation. What's a more general term for this equation?
Self-respiration.
Cellular respiration. This is the respiration that goes on at the cellular level, which is essentially breaking down glucose to release the energy in glucose. So energy enters into the ecosystem from the sun, and what happens to it ultimately? Goes through a lot of organisms, gets fixed by plants, gets transferred from plants to animals. Those animals go off and either die or get consumed. But everybody who consumes some other organism, they're constantly doing what chemical process? Cellular respiration. They're using up that energy, and the low energy molecules that result from that is carbon dioxide that is released back to the atmosphere. So this level of CO2 that is being generated by grasses and forbs and pagan grasses and trees and everybody else, that is a measure of how much energy that is being used up by these organisms as they go through their daily lives. You can measure it a couple of ways. We could put you in a chamber and we can measure the amount of CO2 going into the chamber, and we can measure the amount of CO2 coming out of the chamber, and we can measure your metabolism by looking at how much carbon dioxide you generate. What's another way that we can measure your energy use? Are you guys into kind of folk medicine? No, nobody into folk medicine. In folk medicine, there's a saying. Fever, start with a cold. It's a folksy way of kind of giving you kind of daily advice on how to behave if you have a particular condition. Why do you want to feed a fever?
You want to put energy into your body.
Why?
So then it'll well, if it's having a fever, it's using a lot of energy to fight the...
It is using a lot of energy. So what's another way in which we can determine how much energy you're using?
Your food intake?
Hmm?
Like food? Like whether... Oh, no. Okay.
What is a fever? It's an increase in
Heat.
in body
Increase of heat,
temperature.
body
It's an
temperature.
increase in heat. If you're exercising at the gym, what happens to you?
Your body.
Your
heat
body
up.
temperature goes up, you start sweating to pull your body temperature down. That heat is being generated because you're using more energy.
Mhm.
You have a body temperature because you guys are little metabolic powerhouses. You're burning up a bunch of energy just in the process of sitting there. As a result, it warms up your body and you dissipate that heat to the environment. So you guys are wearing sweaters and things like this because it's cold out. Why are you cold?
Because we're losing body temperature.
Because you're constantly losing body heat to the environment. So you put on extra layers. What does the effect of that extra layering do?
Keeps the body heat.
It holds that body heat
So is
in.
it how much body heat you put out? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so all organisms put out some amount of heat. So at the same time you're putting out carbon dioxide, the other thing that you're putting out is heat. So this energy, a certain amount of that energy gets used for running your body, running your metabolism, doing all the chemical reactions and everything that you need to do in the process of staying alive. But a big chunk of this gets thrown off to the environment in the form of heat. So everywhere on this diagram that you see carbon dioxide being blown off, you can also add to that heat being blown off. So energy comes in the form of light, and it goes through the ecosystem, and it exits in the form of heat. That heat goes into the atmosphere, it just gets dissipated, it just gets lost from the system. Okay.
Is there like an equation to tell how much energy is being used or dissipated, or just based on like the body heat, body temperature?
So
that's being
the
used?
body temperature is kind of an indirect measure
Yeah.
of our energy utilization. If you wanted to quantify this really precisely, like a biologist would, you would actually do exactly what I advocated in a little while ago. We would put you in a closed chamber that had a hose coming in and a hose coming out. The hose going in would be sucking in atmospheric air, and then you're in this little chamber, and as you breathe, you're expelling carbon dioxide that you're producing as you break down glucose. We would measure how much carbon dioxide is coming out, compare that to how much carbon dioxide is coming in. The difference there is actually carbon dioxide that is being generated by you, and then from that amount of carbon dioxide, we would know how many molecules of glucose you're consuming per unit time, and so from that we could get a very precise measure of how much energy you're using.
Huh.
It becomes manifested in your day-to-day lives in that you are warm and that heat dissipates from your body. That warmth is a function of you having a high metabolism. Any of you ever picked up a salamander or a frog or a snake?
Yes.
Yeah, they're generally cool to the
Cold-blooded.
touch because they don't have the same level of basal metabolism that we do. So they're generally consuming much less energy per unit time, and as a result, they generate less heat. And so we're what we refer to as endothermic organisms or homeothermic organisms. We generate our body temperature through metabolic heat. Amphibians and reptiles raise their body temperature not by burning off a lot of energy, but by putting themselves in places that warm them up or cool them down. As a result, they have slightly more variable body temperatures than we do. Our body temperature is relatively constant because we're constantly generating way more energy than we actually need in terms of running the functions of our bodies. And as a result, that warms up our bodies and we have a relatively constant body temperature. So going back to this question, is energy cycled in an ecosystem, or is it a one-way path through an ecosystem?
Cycles.
Oh my gosh. Noah disagrees with all of you. What's what you would disagree on?
If it was a cycle, it would have to say on the Earth, right?
Yeah.
Because there's
this-
energy and then there's CO2. Is there a difference between those two things?
CO2 is kind of, it's a low energy molecule, so the energy that was in glucose is now no longer there because now it's all been broken down to CO2. But it comes in as light and it exits as heat. If for it to be a cycle, what would have to happen to this heat? It would have to be recycled back into the system somehow, but there isn't any way of capturing that. So this heat just gets dissipated to the air around you and it's no longer of any use to the ecosystem. This heat would have to be somehow turned back into the organisms some way in order for energy to be recycled. So energy isn't recycled, it's a one-way path. Now, it does move from organism to organism in an ecosystem. It moves from the plants to the animals, from one animal to another animal, but in the process of doing this, a lot of that energy is lost to just heat being released. Have you guys ever looked at an ecological pyramid? You might have been introduced to this maybe when you were in grade school, I think was the first time I ever saw it. I've drawn this once before in this class earlier in the semester. You guys recall this diagram? At the bottom, what are primary producers?
Grass.
In this case, it would be grass and forbs. It's plants. These are things that are what we refer to as autotrophs. Organisms that create their own energy. They don't have to eat other organisms, they make their own energy. And plants do this because they're getting energy from the sun. What are herbivores? Organisms that eat plants. What are primary carnivores? They're meat eaters. They're the things that consume the herbivores. And then what are the secondary carnivores? They might eat the primary carnivores. And they might also eat herbivores. But these guys aren't eating grass. Why have I drawn the levels different sizes?
The amount of energy it gets from its food.
The amount of energy that it gets from the food. So herbivores eat primary producers, but only about 10% of the energy of the herbivores makes it into the bodies of only about 10% of the energy from the primary producers makes it into the bodies of the herbivores. Where does the other 90% of the energy go? It gets released as heat as a result of metabolism. Only about 10% of the energy of herbivores makes it into the bodies of carnivores. What happens to the other 90%? it gets released as heat. 10% of the energy in the primary carnivores gets into the secondary carnivores. What happens to the other 90%? It gets released as heat. Energy transformations are inherently inefficient in biological systems. The amount of energy making it from one organism to another organism when that first organism is consumed by the second organism is that most of that energy gets lost to heat. It just gets dissipated to the environment. Now, you say, well, so it looks like some of the energy is staying in the ecosystem. But is it? It's not, because when these forbs die and go into the soil, these rabbits die and go into the soil, these pigs die and go into the soil, turkeys die and go into the soil, chickens die and go into the soil, cows die and go into the soil. If they died and went into the soil, if they weren't shipped off the farm for human production, and when grasses die and go into the soil, what happens down here in the soil? We have bacteria. What do these bacteria do?
Eat it.
They eat it. They use it for their own metabolism. They're really, really tiny. It gets converted from glucose to carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide gets blown back out to the atmosphere, and they themselves release heat. Once again, that energy ultimately gets lost. So the 10% that stays in the bodies of these organisms is ultimately released by the bacteria that do decomposition. Yeah, no.
What is the conservation of energy?
Oh, the conservation of energy is, you mean like the law of conservation of energy?
Yeah, doesn't that go against what we're saying here or something?
No, it doesn't, because there's a certain amount of energy coming in, and that same amount of energy ultimately goes out. So
we're saying it gets lost as heat, right?
it gets lost from the ecosystem as heat. So
How does that not just burn? Like, how does the earth not get hotter from that? Is it just so minimal that it doesn't matter?
yeah, so when you think about the law of conservation of energy, that's a universal kind of law. It doesn't just apply to the Earth, it also applies to space between planets, other planets, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of the law of conservation of energy is that in the universe there is a certain amount of energy, and that energy will never increase and never decrease. It can change forms, and that's what's happening in this case. We have electromagnetic energy, energy in the form of waves of light coming from the sun. When it comes into contact with plants, that electromagnetic energy gets converted into chemical energy. When that chemical energy then gets eaten by a cow, there's another conversion of chemical energy from one form of chemical energy to another form of chemical energy. You take the glucose in the plant and it gets converted into adenine triphosphate, which is the energy containing molecule that you're burning up as you sit here in class thinking about all of this. That's a change from a chemical form of energy to another chemical form of energy. And then when you burn up this chemical energy, that energy then goes from a chemical form of energy once again to an electromagnetic form of energy in the form of heat that is being released as that ATP is being used to power your cells. But ultimately, energy is coming in and a bunch of energy is coming out. And the Earth is warm, but it's primarily warmed by solar energy. And so there's a certain amount of solar energy coming out, but let's see. Let me recall some of my basic ecology. If you model the amount of solar energy that comes into the Earth, so the sun is way out here, there's the upper surface of the atmosphere, a certain amount of the sun's energy just gets reflected off of the upper surface of the atmosphere, kind of like water reflecting off the surface of water, so it never even gets into our atmosphere. But of the 100% of solar energy that comes into the atmosphere, clouds absorb a lot of it, so there's absorption. Clouds are made up of water. Water has a high specific heat, means that it can actually absorb a lot of energy before it changes temperature. So clouds actually are capable of absorbing a lot of energy. As it's coming through the atmosphere, it also hits little dust particles and gets scattered, reflected. Doesn't ever quite make it down to the earth because it goes laterally through the atmosphere because it's hitting these little dust particles. So all kinds of things happen to it up in the atmosphere. When it finally gets down to the level of a plant and hitting a leaf, only about 8% of the energy that enters the atmosphere at the upper surface of the atmosphere, only about 8% of this actually is used for photosynthesis. So, in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot of solar energy that comes into the Earth that warms the system as a whole, the Earth system as a whole, but only a tiny fraction of that actually ever gets converted into chemical energy that ends up getting used by organisms. Because, let's see, I don't remember the percentage after absorption and scattering and all that makes it to plants, but I think I'd have to go back and look this up. It's something like 30%, but then the process of photosynthesis itself is an energy transformation process, and those are notoriously inefficient. So that 30% approximately that makes it to the plant, only about 8% of that actually ends up getting converted into glucose, because of course the plant itself also has to feed its own metabolism, etc. And so it's also burning up energy as it's going through the process of creating energy. And so there's a lot of the Earth's warming that is going on that is just due to the sunlight coming in.
Yeah.
A small fraction of that actually gets funneled into doing the chemical energy work of organisms doing their thing. But of that gets fixed, it all gets released back as heat. So there's no creation of energy here. It's just the harnessing of energy that we're getting every day coming from the sun. The sun is a tricky thing. When we think about resources, for those of you in business and economics,